Cold settled over the compound like a second layer of frost, coating the barbed wire, the barracks roofs, and the breath that drifted from the prisoners' mouths. The morning light was thin, struggling through a sky the color of hammered steel. Every sound carried sharply, the clang of a distant gate, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the low murmur of guards beginning their shift. The Japanese women stood in tight lines near the yard, their thin coats pulled close, their hands hidden in sleeves stiff from the night's chill. Fear lived in their eyes before anything else. They had been told what to expect from Americans: punishment, retaliation, exposure, whatever form it took. They believed it would come when they were least prepared. A truck engine rumbled near the main gate. Heads stiffened, shoulders tensed. The women braced as the vehicle rolled into the yard, its tires grinding over ice. Several American soldiers stepped down, their breath steaming in the cold. The prisoners watched every movement with rigid attention, expecting commands barked in anger or gestures sharp enough to cut. Instead, one soldier opened the truck bed and lifted out a stack of thick wool blankets, their dark folds heavy with warmth. Another carried a metal tin releasing a slow curl of steam. The scent of warm bread drifted faintly across the yard. Confusion rippled through the women. They recoiled as the soldiers approached, shrinking back as though preparing for a blow. Some lowered their heads, convinced the kindness was a trick meant to shame them further. The fear swelled so sharply it seemed to shake the air. But the soldiers didn't shout. They didn't demand. They simply knelt and set the blankets on the ground, placing the warm bread beside them as gently as placing water near a wounded animal. For the first time that morning, fear hesitated. They gathered in a small cluster near the barracks wall, their breaths rising in pale clouds as they huddled beneath the thin coats that barely held the cold at bay. The blankets and warm bread lay untouched where the Americans had placed them, the steam lifting into the morning air like something too gentle to trust. None of the women moved toward it. Instead, they leaned closer to one another, speaking in whispers, shaped more by memory than reason. They whispered of punishments they believed would follow, of warnings whispered by teachers and officers long before capture. They recalled being told that Americans used kindness only to expose weakness, that any gift offered would be taken back with humiliation. Some had been taught that foreign soldiers would shame them publicly, tearing away dignity before taking anything else. Others remembered hearing that appearing frail in front of an enemy meant losing honor that could never be restored. Their voices trembled as they repeated these fragments of old instruction, each woman gripping the fear she had carried across the ocean. The thought of stepping forward, of accepting a blanket or a piece of bread under watchful eyes, felt like placing themselves on a stage built for their undoing. Exposure was its own kind of terror. Even lifting their heads felt dangerous. Yet when they dared to glance at the Americans, the men stood quietly near the truck, speaking among themselves in low, steady tones. There were no shouts, no harsh gestures, no signs of the retaliation the women had prepared their minds to endure. The soldiers seemed more puzzled than threatening, their calm movements contradicting everything the prisoners believed they understood. Confusion settled over the yard. heavy but not unkind. The old warning still held the women in place, yet something in the morning air had shifted, creating a small space where fear and doubt struggled side by side. The sergeant stood a few paces back from his men, boots planted in the frost-hardened earth, as he watched the scene unfold with a quiet tension of his own. He had seen prisoners before, wary, exhausted, uncertain, but nothing like the rigid fear gripping these women. Their reactions were sharper, their movements tighter, as if every muscle had been trained to anticipate harm before it came. When one soldier took a single step closer, several of the women flinched so visibly that he stopped mid-stride. The sergeant noticed everything, the way their eyes darted toward exits that didn't exist, the way their hands stayed hidden in sleeves, as though exposure itself carried risk, the way their bodies angled subtly away from the Americans, even when the men backed off. Their fear wasn't momentary. It was ingrained, settled deep into them, like cold that couldn't be shaken off. He folded his arms loosely across his chest, not in defiance, but in thought, letting the morning breath rise slowly from his lips. Duty told him to ensure the prisoners were fed, warmed, and accounted for. That was simple, written clearly in every regulation he'd ever followed. But compassion pulled at him with a quieter insistence, urging him to understand what lived beneath the surface of their reactions. Something more than captivity had shaped this kind of terror. He watched as a small gust lifted a blanket's corner, and one woman recoiled as though struck by a sudden warning. He frowned, not with frustration, but with the growing weight of questions he couldn't yet answer. Why did they expect harm where he intended none? Why did kindness seem to unsettle them more than the cold? He stayed still, shoulders relaxed, letting the silence settle around him. He knew instinctively that pushing harder would only fracture the fragile calm forming in the yard. In that quiet moment, duty stood beside empathy, and he understood he would need both to reach them. Long before the cold morning settled over the camp, long before the women found themselves standing on foreign soil, they had learned lessons whispered in dimly lit rooms and reinforced by voices they trusted. Those teachings resurfaced now, shaping every flinch, every lowered gaze. Every moment they recoiled from the blankets resting harmlessly on the ground. Fear did not rise from the present. It rose from memories carefully planted in the past. They had been told that American captors punished disobedience without hesitation, that kindness shown by an enemy was merely the first step toward humiliation. Some remembered warnings delivered in tight circles of young women. If Americans offered food, it was only to break their dignity. If they gave warmth, it was to expose weakness. Acts of mercy, they were told, hid a darker intention. Others recalled stories passed along by officers, claiming that being seen accepting help from foreign men marked a woman forever, stripping her of honor that could never be regained. These myths had settled deeply, becoming a kind of internal script the women followed without even realizing it. Exposure, not of injury, but of vulnerability, had been framed as a danger equal to physical harm. They had been taught to avoid any gesture that might make them appear dependent. For dependency meant surrender, and surrender meant shame that could shadow them for the rest of their lives. Now, In the quiet tension of the camp yard, those lessons dictated every reaction. When blankets were placed before them, their bodies stiffened. When warm bread released its gentle steam, they looked away. When American soldiers stepped back to avoid frightening them, the distance brought no comfort, only confusion. Every movement they made was governed by expectations shaped long before capture. The fear gripping them was not born of the present moment. It was the echo of warnings memorized in the dark. The Americans tried again, as the sun climbed weakly through the winter haze, casting pale light across the camp yard. A corporal approached first, carrying 2 folded blankets pressed against his chest. He stopped several feet away from the women and lowered them gently to the frozen ground. The wool landed softly, but even that small movement made the nearest prisoner tense, her shoulders rising as though bracing for impact. The corporal stepped back at once, hoping distance might ease their fear. Yet the women only retreated farther, clutching their thin coats, as if the fabric could shield them from more than the cold. Another soldier set down a loaf of warm bread, its steam curling into the air like a fragile assurance of comfort. The scent drifted across the yard, reaching the women in faint waves. Hunger tightened their expressions, but none dared reach for it. One woman's hand twitched toward the bread before she pulled it back sharply, folding it beneath her sleeve as though hiding the instinct itself. Minutes passed, and the cold grew heavier. The women's breaths shortened, and a few swayed subtly, fighting the fatigue settling into their limbs. Their feet shifted in the frost, leaving shallow marks that filled again as wind swept across the yard. The Americans watched with increasing concern. They had seen prisoners weakened by weather before, but never prisoners who feared relief itself. The sergeant exchanged a quiet look with his men, each recognizing the same truth. The problem was not the cold that bit through clothing, or the hunger that hollowed the women's cheeks. It was the fear that lived deeper, fear so ingrained it overpowered every instinct to seek warmth or food. Their offers of help, however sincere, had become triggers rather than comfort. The soldiers stepped back collectively, leaving space not out of frustration, but out of a dawning understanding. They were facing wounds they could not see, wounds colder and older than the morning air. The sergeant paused in the center of the yard, blanket still resting where he had set it, bread cooling untouched beside it. The women's rigid posture, the way their eyes flicked between him and the ground, told him that any attempt to move closer would only turn fear into panic. So he drew a slow breath, let the cold settle in his chest, and stepped back. One careful stride, then another. He stopped only when he reached the shadow of a barracks wall, placing himself far enough that his presence no longer towered over them. The change was small at first, barely visible. The tight lines of their shoulders eased by a fraction, as if the air between them had widened just enough to breathe. The wind cut across the camp in sharp bursts, but without a figure looming in front of them. The women seemed to brace less, their bodies no longer coiled in the same rigid anticipation. A few blinked rapidly, adjusting to the space they had not expected to receive. The sergeant kept his posture open, hands loose at his sides, gaze lowered to avoid the intensity that eye contact could carry. He let stillness do the work that words never could. Around him, the camp continued its morning rhythm. Boots on gravel, distant voices, the muted clatter of metal. But he stayed motionless, grounding the moment with quiet intention. Gradually, one of the women lifted her head. Her gaze moved cautiously, tracing the distance he had created, studying the empty space as though it were an unfamiliar gift. Her breathing slowed, no longer sharp with panic. For a brief moment, her eyes met his across the yard, a fragile, flickering connection that held for only a heartbeat before she looked away again. But the moment was enough, not trust, not yet, but the faintest crack in the wall fear had built around them. A gust of wind slipped through the yard, brushing against the women, where they stood gathered in a tight line. The movement was gentle, but it lifted the edge of a scarf just enough for the sergeant to glimpse the skin beneath. For an instant, the morning light revealed the faint outline of bruising along a jaw, the pale shimmer of frostbite on a cheekbone, and the dry, cracked surface of skin worn thin by weeks of travel and exposure. It was a fleeting sight, unintentional and unguarded, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured before arriving here. The sergeant's breath tightened, though he did not let the reaction reach his face. Years of discipline steadied him, urging him to lower his gaze at once, giving her the dignity of not being studied. He shifted slightly so the angle broke, pretending to adjust his sleeve, allowing her time to tug the scarf back into place without feeling watched. The fabric fell again over her features, restoring the barrier she clearly depended on. But the brief glimpse stayed with him. It sharpened the quiet conflict already forming in his thoughts, pulling him deeper into questions he hadn't yet found answers for. These women weren't just fearful. They were injured, worn down in ways that went far beyond the cold morning or the unfamiliarity of the camp. Their silence wasn't defiance. It was protection shaped by hardship he could only imagine. He looked across the yard at his men, still standing back as he had instructed. Their expressions were patient, concerned, but they hadn't seen what he had. He carried the moment alone, letting it settle into the part of him that shaped every decision he made. Compassion rose steadily, not with urgency, but with a quiet weight that pressed him to move carefully, to give these women more than warmth or food could offer. He returned his gaze to the ground, giving them space once more. The fear between them had not broken, but something else had formed alongside it, a deeper understanding of the hurt they hid beneath scarves and silence. The sergeant approached the supply truck with slow, unhurried steps, the cold air lifting small clouds of breath from his lips. He reached inside and retrieved another loaf of bread, still warm beneath its cloth covering, and a folded blanket, whose weight promised a comfort none of the women had dared claim. He held both items carefully, as though carrying something fragile, then walked back toward the open yard. But he did not close the distance. Instead, he stopped well before reaching them. At the same invisible boundary they had drawn with their fear, there he knelt, lowering himself until he no longer towered above their line of sight. He placed the blanket gently on the frosted earth, then set the warm bread beside it, careful not to let the gesture appear rushed or expectant. When he finished, he stood slowly, hands kept visible and open, and stepped away without looking directly at them. The women watched in rigid silence, the steam rising from the bread curled into the cold morning like a fragile invitation. It sent drifting just far enough to reach them. Yet none moved. Their bodies held the same tension as before, as if kindness itself might mask a hidden consequence. One woman's breath hitched faintly, her eyes fixed on the loaf, but her hands locked in place beneath her sleeves. The sergeant retreated until he stood with his men again, creating a wide circle of space that settled over the yard. The Americans waited, quiet, unmoving, offering no gesture that could be mistaken for pressure. The only movement came from the wind brushing against canvas tents and the warm steam lifting slowly from the bread. At last, one of the women stepped forward. Her motion was small, hesitant, shaped by fear and need in equal measure. She crouched, reaching out with a trembling hand, pausing once as though expecting the act to trigger something unseen. When nothing happened, her fingers closed around the loaf. She held it close, the warmth seeping into her palms, anchoring her in a moment she had not believed possible. The yard remained silent, but something subtle shifted in the space between them. The woman who had taken the bread sat near the edge of the yard, her back resting against the cold wall of the barracks. She held the loaf carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid a firmer grip might undo the fragile safety she had found. The warmth seeped slowly into her hands, spreading across fingers stiffened by weeks of cold and tension. Around her, the other women watched with cautious eyes, their breaths rising in thin threads against the morning air. The Americans remained where they stood, offering no commands, no guiding gestures, no expectation. Their stillness filled the space with a quiet patience, allowing the women to decide what the moment would become. The sergeant's gaze stayed soft, distant enough not to intrude, but attentive enough to notice every shift in the yard's fragile balance. The woman lowered her head, drawing a slow breath that steadied the tremble in her hands. Then, without lifting her eyes, she whispered two faint words, almost lost to the wind, almost too soft to catch. But in the cold silence they carried. "Thank you." The sound was small, unadorned, and nearly broken at its edges. Yet it moved through the line of women like a spark beneath frost. A few turned toward her, not in alarm but in quiet surprise. One leaned closer to a companion and murmured something low, her voice carrying none of the sharp warnings that had once filled every whispered exchange. Another answered softly, the beginning of a conversation that had not been possible even hours before. Their words remained gentle, almost weightless, as though they feared speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile shift taking place. But they spoke about the bread, about the warmth, about the simple fact that no punishment had followed the gesture. Slowly, the tightness in their posture eased, replaced by the cautious beginnings of connection. The Americans did not move. They observed without stepping into the moment, letting the women's voices rise on their own terms. Something long held in silence had finally begun to thaw. They gathered inside one of the quieter corners of the yard as the morning sun pushed weakly through the cloud cover, softening the frost that clung to every surface. The warmth from the bread still lingered in their hands, And for the first time since capture, the women allowed themselves to sit without bracing for an order they feared they could not endure. Their voices rose in careful fragments, shaped not by confidence, but by the fragile relief of finally being heard. They spoke of long marches where cold seeped into their bones, until they could no longer tell where pain ended and numbness began. They recalled the cramped transport journeys, where exhaustion pressed down like a weight no one could lift. But more than hardship, they spoke of the fear that had followed them long before they crossed the ocean. It was a fear woven into lessons repeated since childhood. Warnings that a woman's worth rested on dignity preserved at all costs. That exposure of weakness brought shame deeper than injury. That dishonor could reach their families even from distant soil. One woman traced her sleeve with trembling fingers as she described how the threat of being seen in vulnerability felt more dangerous than the cold itself. Another explained that accepting help from a foreign man, even in desperation, had been painted as a loss no one could recover from. They had carried these beliefs into every moment of captivity, shaping their silence, their caution, the rigid masks they wore to protect identities frayed by war. As they continued, their words revealed something quieter and heavier. War had not only stripped them of safety, it had stripped them of the selves they once recognized. They spoke of feeling unanchored, unsure which parts of their former lives still belonged to them. Shame, fear, and survival had woven together until silence felt like the only shield left. The Americans remained nearby, listening without intrusion, letting the women's truth settle into the brittle winter air. In that shared quiet, understanding deepened, not through explanation, but through the weight of stories finally spoken aloud. The afternoon light softened as it stretched across the yard, turning the frost into a muted shimmer that made the camp feel less harsh than it had in days. The women sat with blankets draped over their shoulders, their bodies no longer held in the tight, defensive postures that had defined their first hours here. The bread had been eaten slowly, carefully, not only because hunger demanded it, but because each warm bite contradicted something they had once believed unshakable. They had been taught to expect cruelty from American hands, to brace for punishment, humiliation, or cold indifference. Those warnings had shaped their instincts so deeply that even mercy felt like a threat. Yet the truth standing before them now held none of the sharp edges they had prepared for. The soldiers had stepped back instead of forward. They had spoken softly when loud authority was expected. They had offered blankets without demanding gratitude and food without attaching shame. Every act, though simple, chipped away at the myths the women had carried across an ocean. The sergeant watched from a distance, arms resting loosely at his sides, his posture steady but unassuming. He did not see himself as offering anything extraordinary. He had only done what felt human, setting bread on the ground, leaving warmth for those afraid to take it, letting silence be a bridge instead of a barrier. Yet, in the girl's eyes, these gestures became something larger, proof that the world was wider than the stories they had been told. Slowly, they began to feel the shift within themselves. Fear no longer controlled every breath. Shame loosened its grip as they realized no one here wished to expose their vulnerability. The kindness they received did not demand surrender. It invited healing. Warmth became more than temperature. It became a quiet reassurance. Food became more than sustenance. It became a sign that they were seen without judgment. Humility, offered by strangers, began to mend what war had fractured. In the soft calm of that winter afternoon, truth stood gently beside myth, and for the first time, the women allowed themselves to believe the difference. The next morning rose quietly. The sky washed in pale tones that softened every line of the camp. Frost clung to the ground in delicate patterns, and thin trails of smoke drifted from the kitchen stove, carrying the faint scent of rising dough. The women stepped into the yard slowly, wrapped in the blankets the Americans had left for them. The wool hung heavily around their shoulders, but there was a gentleness in the way they held the fabric now. Less like a borrowed shield, more like a reminder that warmth could come from unexpected hands. The bread, too, lingered in their thoughts. What had begun as a simple offering had become something symbolic, a quiet act that challenged every belief they had once accepted without question. The memory of its warmth remained in their palms, in the way their breathing steadied after tasting it, in the way fear loosened just enough to let their voices return. These gestures, small in their moment, had begun to thread a fragile sense of safety through lives shaped by uncertainty. Around them, the camp stirred with the calm rhythm of ordinary tasks. Soldiers moved between supply sheds, checked the fences, and prepared transport logs. Yet nothing about the morning felt ordinary to the women. As they looked at the men who had shown them patience instead of punishment, they felt a quiet shift that echoed deeper than the cold. It reminded them that kindness, offered without demand, could soften even the sharp edges carved by war. Across the world, in places scarred by the same conflict, similar acts were unfolding. Medics staying through the night beside wounded enemies, villagers sharing food with prisoners, soldiers choosing mercy over retaliation. These moments rarely made it into reports or official histories. Yet they carried a weight all their own. They showed that even in the harshest years of the war, humanity had found ways to survive alongside suffering. The women stood together in the morning light, blankets gathered around them, their breaths rising gently into the quiet air. War had taken so much: home, certainty, identity. But here, in a small corner of a foreign land, something healing had begun. It did not erase the past, but it offered a different truth to carry forward. War divides. Humanity heals.